Afternoon, everyone. Today we're coming to you from Sharpsburg, Maryland. Actually, I'm coming to you from inside my B&B before we actually started talking about the battle because I feel you guys need some background before we go into this very complex and very important battle. Pardon me. One of the things I think we should start with is the different types of generalship of George B. McClellan, the Union commander, and Robert E. Lee, the Confederate commander. When George McClellan took command of the Union Army in 1861, it was disorganized. The men were disillusioned. Everything was a mess. Nothing was organized. So what he did was he stepped in. He organized the army. He got everything lined up the way it should. He gave men regimental pride. And one thing they really loved about McClellan was that they knew that he was not going to recklessly waste their lives. Now, what does that mean other than he wasn't going to commit them to battle, which is pretty much what it was, which is why his men loved him, because he wasn't going to have them killed. And what happened is he moved extremely slow. It took him forever to do anything, and it drove President Lincoln completely mad. One time, President Lincoln asked General McClellan, "Could I please borrow the army since you're evidently not using it?" Not direct quote, but you get my general idea. And what happened was in 1862, in what was called the Peninsula Campaign, George McClellan was moving the army toward Richmond, which was the goal, to take Richmond. And what happened was in one of the battles outside Richmond, General Joseph Johnston, who was the overall commander of the Confederate forces, he got a serious wound. And up to this point, Robert E. Lee had been an advisor on President Jefferson Davis's staff. And so at last minute, because they're in a pinch, they just lost their commanding officer, they put Robert E. Lee in command of the entire army of that area. And McClellan was actually quite happy with this idea. He called Lee timid, not one who will step up in a situation. Spoke very poorly of Lee and fully expected to manhandle him. And what happened next was Lee, who was outnumbered almost 2-1, decided to do a daring move and split his army in the face of the enemy and hit McClellan repeatedly, again and again in different spots. Thus began this Battle of 7 Days in the summer of 1862. And 6 of the 7 battles of the 7 days were actually Union victories, but McClellan panicked. And he'd always flip out. He would always step back. He was always convinced that the enemy had superior numbers. Edwin Stanton, Secretary of War, said of him, he would be convinced that the enemy had 1,000,000 men, and he would, no, oh, let me start that over. If he had 1,000,000 men, he'd be convinced that the enemy had 2 and would sit in the mud and yell until he got 3. McClellan did not want to move, and he was always convinced that the Confederate army was so much bigger. So he fell back again and again and again, even though his army was winning. 6 of the 7 days they won. Lee wound up losing 20,000 men attacking McClellan and pushing him back to the river. But one thing he did gain out of that was he pushed McClellan back, but he got right here. He got in McClellan's head, and he would never get out of there. He had this uncanny ability, Robert E. Lee did, of reading his enemy, which is exactly what he did. So, and now what happened here was because McClellan was going so slow, President Lincoln decided to remove him from command, put a more aggressive general. But after the disastrous Second Manassas, under General John Pope, he was forced to put McClellan back in charge again. And when that happened, there was joy in the Army of the Potomac, which is the Northern Army. Because some men even broke down in tears because they were so happy that their beloved general was back. And what had happened was Lee just fell into the daring move to head north. And what their plan was to hit Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, and destroy the Union Army in the north, possibly, though it's a long shot, to get a British and French recognition of the Confederacy and force Lincoln to stop the war. And what happened was, as they stepped forward and they left, McClellan, moving slower as always, what he wound up doing was one of his soldiers in the 27th Indiana found a neatly wrapped package of cigars. And in there was a copy of General Lee's Special Order 191, which outlined his movements, what they were going to do, where they were going, and what they were going to do when they got there. They passed up through the ranks, and there was an officer on McClellan's staff who actually knew Lee and knew his handwriting and confirmed that it was legitimate. And McClellan got pretty happy with himself, and he said, if I can't whip Bobby Lee with these, I'd be willing to go home. and then sat on it for 18 hours. Didn't do a dang thing. Oh, he wired President Lincoln telling him that he had the tools to destroy the Confederate Army, but he did nothing for 18 hours when he could have very easily been on Lee's tail and getting us all wrapped up. So eventually they come to Sharpsburg, Maryland. That's where Lee converges after taking Harper's Ferry. And they come to the farmland here. And on this day, the 16th, you had Lee, who had 40,000 men, standing across the field from McClellan, who had over 80,000 men. And it was basically a situation of moves and counter moves. General Lee once said, "To be a good soldier, all one must do is love the army. To be a good commander, one must be willing to order the death of the thing they love." You will see how George McClellan was one and Robert E. Lee was the other. So, now we went over 3 minutes, but had to give you some really good background. More to come.